There are going to be times in an encounter when you're trying to do something and you come across an action that you're going to try to do, something like sudden charge, and you're going to be wondering, well, does this happen simultaneous? Is one thing subordinate to another? And these are terms that you're going to come across and you might not understand. And actually, the differences are pretty subtle, and there is a lot of contention out there. If you did a search for simultaneous or subordinate actions on the web, you'd see that there's a lot of discussion. I'm going to try to kind of cut through some of that and give you just a good basic understanding of the difference between a simultaneous and a subordinate action. And we're going to see how we can use them in an encounter. So, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So, we're going to go ahead and start with simultaneous actions. Now, at any given time in your turn, you can utilize only one single action, activity or free action that doesn't require a trigger, period. The free action in this particular case for simultaneous means it doesn't have a trigger. For single action activities, as well as free actions without a trigger, you must first complete one action before starting another. So you can't kind of do an action and then in the middle say, oh, let me go ahead and grab this thing off the floor, open a door, grab something out of my pack, or interact with a different weapon. You have to complete things one after another. So there's a good example from the book, and that would be sudden charge. So if you're using sudden charge, which involves striding twice, then striking, you can't interrupt the movement to open a door, to pick something up, or to interact with something in your pack or in one of your pouches, nor can you perform part of the movement, attack, and then continue with the rest of the movement. Sudden charge is stride, stride, strike, so you have to stride, stride, strike. You can't kind of interchange things or put additional things in there. These occur one after another without interruption, and you have to go through the movement as written in a fluid series of motions. Another good example, not from the book, but I think it works out pretty well, is quick draw. So if you have quick draw and you'll read that particular feat, and what it is you draw your weapon and attack with the same motion. So you're interacting with your equipment to draw the weapon, and then you're going to strike with that weapon. It does have a strike in it. Now, just because it has strike in it doesn't mean that you could use another feat, like let's say skirmish strike, which is a 6th level feat. That reads your feat and weapon move in tandem, either step then strike or strike then step. So by doing quick draw, you couldn't get an additional movement in there by substituting the strike in quick draw for skirmish strike. If you did that, then what you're kind of doing is you're building a bunch of combos from those fighting games and trying to get a bunch of different actions together in order to try and do these massive chains of activities. And that's not really how the rules are intended. Now, if you read the description of simultaneous actions and then you read the description of subordinate actions, you might think that they're very similar and not quite get what the difference is. And basically, the difference is that with a subordinate action, you are modifying the basic step. So we're going to go ahead and give the general description of a subordinate action. So certain actions may grant you the opportunity to perform a simpler action, often one of the basic actions like strike or interact under different circumstances or with modified effects. And that is kind of the big difference, is that particular phrase, under different circumstances or with a modified effect. This subordinate action, even though it's modified, retains its usual traits and effects, but is altered, and it's going to be indicated in the larger text description as to how it's modified. Maybe the stride action is shorter. Maybe the interact is free. It just depends on how it is indicated in the description of what the larger action is. I have a good example from the book, and I'll have one of my own, but from the book it is, for instance, an activity instructing you to stride up to half your speed modifies the typical distance covered during a stride. However, the stride itself still maintains the move trait, and because it still has the move trait, it would trigger any reaction tied to movement, like attack of opportunity, but this does not allow it to gain additional traits from the larger action unless it is explicitly specified. So you couldn't just infer that, well, this particular stride isn't going to do the move because there is no move written in the higher level feat. It still has the move trait because it specifically says that it is a stride at half your speed. So therefore, it's still a stride and still has the move trait. Now, when using a subordinate action, you don't need to spend extra actions or reactions since that cost is already accounted for. If the particular larger action was a single action or a double action, you wouldn't need to add a third action onto it simply because it said stride in there. It's already kind of baked into the cost. Now, it's important to note that using an activity is distinct from using any of its subordinate actions. For example, good example from the book is the quicken condition from the haste spell grants you an extra action to either stride or strike each turn. But this extra action cannot be used for an activity that involves stride or strike. So you couldn't do a double strike in here or something along those lines. It explicitly states stride or strike, so you must stride or strike. Now, similarly, if an action specifies if the next action you use is a strike, you can't substitute a double strike for the strike in that thing. It explicitly states it has to be a strike, so it must be a basic strike. So any activity that would involve a strike wouldn't count. It has to be the strike itself, as starting an activity is not the same as using the strike basic action. Shove is another example that everyone has, so I think it's a really good example. Shove, you push a creature away from you and you're attempting an athletics check against your target's fortitude DC. On a success or critical success, you are allowed to stride, but the stride is modified. On a critical success, you push your target up to 10 feet away from you and you can stride after it, but you must move the same distance and in the same direction. That stride has been modified to only 10 feet, and on a success, you push your target back 5 feet. Same thing, you can stride after it, but you must move at the same distance and in the same direction. The stride that you get is modified. So with this, you can't perform the shove and then open the door beside you, and then all of a sudden now do the stride. Just like in the simultaneous, the big difference is that the stride was modified. Now, on the other hand, there are free actions that have triggers, and I can think a good example of this would be Halfling Luck. And there are also reactions that have triggers, and a good example for this one, once again, that kind of most people have as long as you have a shield, is Shield Block work differently. If you have a free action with a trigger or a reaction with a trigger, you can use these actions whenever a trigger occurs, even if it happens in the middle of another action. So if you were doing something that if you did a shove and that shove allowed you to move because you got a critical success 10 feet, well, though that 10 feet that you were able to move might trigger an attack of opportunity. You can use your shield block. Or maybe if you were doing some particular activity that required you to do a roll and you rolled poorly, but it was in the middle of the series of actions, well, you could still use Halfling Luck to re-roll. Now, I hope this video kind of helped clarify the difference between a simultaneous and a subordinate action. They are very close. The distinction is very slight. And in truth, you're probably not going to actually run into it very often as long as you perform the action in the rules kind of as written. And in some cases, if it's not super clear, the rules as they were intended, which granted is harder to kind of figure out and parse in your head. But still, as long as you kind of keep with the flavor of it, you're not going to run into too many problems. However, if you did really want to know what the difference between a simultaneous and a subordinate action was, that's pretty much it. Simultaneous is your series of actions, and a subordinate means that you're modifying a basic action as part of those series of actions. On both of them, you can't stack them, so you can't chain a bunch of actions together. If something says strike, then it has to be the basic action strike and not another activity or action that includes a strike. Now, I do hope you liked this video, and I do hope it cleared some things up. And if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.